Our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Luke chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Well, I don't know how many of you are fans of Real Time with Bill Maher. He drives me crazy. I don't watch him that much. He drives me crazy, but that's kind of his thing. He likes to drive people crazy, whether you're on the left or on the right. He drives you crazy, okay? Now, if you're in the middle, I don't know if he drives you crazy all the time or drives you crazy none of the time. I'm not sure. I suspect it's actually the former, that he just drives you crazy all the time. But he drives me crazy half the time. But my favorite segment is his segment of the show that's called New Rules. And what he does is he just promotes these ideas, these common sense proposals that would really make sense to a lot of us. And one of my favorite ones that he ever said was simply this. He said, look, new rule. We have a Bill of Rights. What we need is a Bill of Responsibilities. This makes a lot of sense because we like to talk about our rights. All right? You hear this all the time. My rights have been violated. You're violating my rights. I have a right to this. I have a right to that. And we don't like to talk as much about responsibilities. See, rights are about us. I have them. You have them. But responsibilities are about others. What is my responsibility to you? What is my responsibility to my neighbor? What is my responsibility to the world? What is my responsibility to posterity? And this has always been a part of our thinking until I think recently maybe it's faded somewhat. That we've forgotten a long-standing idea that privilege comes with responsibility. This always used to be accepted, that if you had privilege, if you were blessed with privilege, you had a responsibility attached to it. And now I think there are too many folks for whom privilege is treated as if it's their right, and it comes without a responsibility to deploy that privilege in ways that help others. Our story begins with Jesus simply worshiping in the synagogue on the Sabbath as he would every week as a good religious person. And he shows up at the synagogue, and it says, there is a woman who appeared with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. Now, this is speaking to some kind of physical infirmity that the woman has, and clearly it's not fatal. It's 18 years, okay? So she has lived with this for a long time. It's not a fatal injury. It is simply something that she's lived with. She isn't dying. She's probably used to it, and probably they were used to her. So they probably, saw her every week at services at the synagogue. She showed up every week, and she was probably just known as that woman, whoever she was, okay? And it's really easy for us to get used to injustice. When we see injustice or inequality or prejudice or suffering, we can get so accustomed to it that we actually stop noticing it. I think that's why for a lot of us, we notice these problems in society more when we travel. That when you go overseas, it's a lot easier to notice problems in that society because it's a different context, all right? So we often go somewhere else, whether it's another part of the United States or whether it's another nation in the world. We travel somewhere and we see all the problems in that society. And maybe for the people who live in that society, that's just the way it is. They're used to it. They don't see it. And probably vice versa happens. They probably come here and go, didn't you notice that? Don't you notice that? I came to here and I saw all these problems you have. And we're like, well, that's just how it is here. So it's easier to notice problems somewhere else than down the street from where we live every single day. Jesus, however, has that ability to see everything. And so when Jesus saw her, he called her over. See, Jesus noticed her. She didn't ask. One of the interesting things about this particular healing is she does not call out to Jesus. You know, most of the healing stories involve someone who either calls out to Jesus or goes out of their way to see Jesus, or maybe has friends who take them to Jesus in search of healing. Whatever it is, most of the healing stories involve someone who is actively seeking it. But in this case, she didn't. She was probably so used to her own condition that even for her, it was just the way it is. This is my lot in life. This is how I have to live. And that it was Jesus who said, no, you don't have to live that way. It was Jesus who decided not to tolerate that as her condition in life. And so he heals her. He doesn't even ask. He doesn't say, hey, would you like to be healed? You know, he's asked that question of other people. He didn't ask. He didn't do anything. He simply called her over and healed her. Jesus proactively shattered the status quo. He wasn't willing to accept that the way things were the way they ought to be. And he used his power to disrupt the status quo. He used his power to step in and make something right that probably most of the people had just accepted as an injustice, as an unfairness, as a, oh, that's so, too bad for her. They just accepted it and went on with their lives. And Jesus stepped in and said, no, this isn't the way it has to be. And he made it right. Now, not everybody saw this as a good thing. The synagogue leader is indignant because what the leader of the synagogue sees is not the relief of the woman, but the violation of the rules. So the positive result wasn't as important to him as the fact that the rules had been violated. And it's easy for us to condemn him for this attitude, but I'll get into why that might not necessarily be fair. Okay. Because I think that this is actually something that we're all guilty of at times. See, I wonder if you are ever indignant over a good result. You've ever done this? Because I have, all right? Someone does something the wrong way, and it's the wrong way. You see them about to do it, and you go, that is the wrong way to do it. And then it works, all right? Now, I'm saying this because this comes out of me. By the way, just so you know, just go off on a little aside here. So you may have noticed that I changed my outfit between the baptism and here. Okay, because there's a symbolism behind everything, all right? And so when I'm wearing my clerical vestments, it's a symbol of clerical authority, which is an important part of doing something like a baptism, or I wear it for a funeral, or I wear it for a wedding. Those are the moments where I feel it's important for me to wear the symbols of clerical authority. I'm dressed in an open collar shirt and jeans to preach, because I'm just one of you, all right? And that's the symbol. The symbol, all right, I may have studied this stuff, but if you think I'm better at following Jesus than you, no. All right, I'm just another person who is trying to figure out how to follow Jesus in my life. And I fail so many times in my life. Okay, I fail every single day. And when I'm lucky, I fail in a way that you don't notice. And the way you don't notice is when I fail on the inside. Okay, so one of my failures on the inside is when somebody does something and I know it's wrong and it works and I'm going, oh, they just got lucky. They just got lucky. They lucked out. I can't believe it worked. Because, again, to be honest, I'm just one of you. I see somebody doing it and I know it's the wrong way. The least Christian attitude that I have is hoping that it doesn't work. All right? And that is not the attitude of faith, right? If you see someone doing it the wrong way, you should be hoping it works. You should always be wanting the best for them. All right? So you should be going, yeah, I know you're doing it the wrong way, but maybe, just maybe you'll get lucky, maybe it'll work, and maybe, best of all, I'm going to learn that my right way wasn't the only right way. Maybe I'm going to learn that what you've hit on is a second right way of doing it. All right? And that should be the attitude that I have. Emphasis on should be the attitude that I have. Okay? But sometimes, and you try not to express it, you try to hide it, we're all, or at least I am, to some extent, you're trying to put forth that image. Oh, I'm so happy for you. So happy it worked out. And on the inside, I'm like, you got lucky. So the synagogue leader, he's indignant over a good result. And he has an alternative. He says, look, here's the right way to do it. There's 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days, not on the Sabbath. As far as he's concerned, Jesus could have said, come back tomorrow. Meet me here tomorrow morning. Just come back tomorrow. I'll be here. You be here. Okay, I have nothing on my calendar tomorrow. Come on back and I will cure you tomorrow. And she would have. And he would have. But, we've all heard that phrase, justice delayed is justice denied. Okay? Because when you're on the bad side of the situation, okay, the delay matters. When everything is fine for you, the delay doesn't matter. And this happens to us all the time, okay? Like, for instance, one of my favorite shows that I've been slow binging. You never have a show that you enjoy so much you only dribble it out to yourself a little bit at a time. So I've been watching The Pit on Max. It's a show about an emergency room, okay? And one of the things about a crowded emergency room, if you've ever seen it, right, is all these people in the waiting room who are waiting to be seen. And it's not that they don't have a problem, all right? No one wants to be in the emergency room. No one sits there and says, hey, you know what I want to do today? I want to go hang out in an ER waiting room because I would love to do that today. You're there because you're in pain, there's a problem, but they've got all these people who are waiting to be seen because there are other people with bigger problems ahead of them in line. All right? No one wants to wait. And it's easy and it's infuriating to us when you have a problem and there's a person who can solve it and the person says, hang on, I'll be with you in just a minute. Okay? That actually doesn't feel great when a minute becomes an hour or an hour becomes an afternoon or an afternoon becomes a day. It doesn't feel good when you're on that side of it. So as far as Jesus is concerned, when he saw the problem, the time to fix it is now. The time to fix it wasn't tomorrow. It may have been 18 years, and when it's not your problem, it's easy to say, what is the difference between 18 years and 18 years and a day? When you're in pain, when you are suffering, there's a difference between 18 years and 18 years and a day. See, the status quo becomes just natural when we're on the good side of it. When we're on the good side of it, we have no reason to question it. We maybe have no reason to notice it. We don't notice our advantages because that's just how it is. But Jesus calls them out. Jesus calls them out and says, you hypocrites. Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? They're healing their animals. They're solving their animals' thirst. And they think this is fine. It's normal. This is what they do every Sabbath. They make sure that their animals have water to drink. They see their own problems and the solution to their own problems as being normal and natural and justifiable and the way things ought to be. And they don't see the woman's problem as being as important. And doesn't that happen to all of us? That it's too easy to only see the world from our vantage point. Do we see the world from the vantage point of those whose lives are very different than our own? And not just about material things. Sure, it's hard, whether it's a matter of a person living in poverty or a person, who struggles to have health care. There are so many life situations that are different. It is difficult for single people to understand what it's like to be married. It's difficult for people who are parents to understand the lives of those who don't have children and vice versa. All of those kinds of things are difficult to understand. Different races, different ethnicities, all create their own different situations for going through the world. Different privileges, different disadvantages, all put us in different situations in the world. And sometimes we have a difficulty recognizing the biases we bring into every situation because of how we live. In theology, there's a technical term. They refer to it as social location. What is your social location? Because empathy, sometimes just gets broadly mislabeled as the I feel your pain, okay? But it's more than that. Empathy is about the ability to see the world through someone else's lens. And that means the whole world through it, to appreciate their fears, to appreciate their concerns, and really to ask yourself the question from that perspective, from the other person's perspective, what would fairness look like to them? What does fairness look like to the person in a situation that's very different from my own? It's not easy to do that. And so often, we get so wrapped up in our own vantage point. I've even been in situations, because I went to a very progressive seminary, and I remember sitting in the middle of an argument between people who could all credibly identify as being members of a group that was oppressed in a different way in our society, and they got into this fierce argument over who had it worse. Rather than commiserating and understanding, hey, we're all members of groups that are discriminated against in our society. We're all members of groups who have problems navigating our society. They got into a who has it worse argument with one another because all they could see was their own disadvantage. All they could see was their own issue, and they didn't even have the empathy to say, oh, okay, wait a second. I have this problem. I'm discriminated against in this way, and you have this other problem, and it's not a race. It's not a competition. But rather, we all have an interest in a just and fair world. And the way we get to a just and fair world is when we're able to not just sit back and say, well, it's a fair world because this is fair the way I see it, but rather to be able to look at the world from the vantage point of all of the different perspectives in the world, combine all of the ways in which they understand what fairness would look like, and then try to achieve a world of fairness that is truly fair to everyone who's involved. All right? But it's hard. It's hard. Jesus says to them, ought not this woman, and the key word is ought not she be set free on the Sabbath day. The key word is ought, and the problem is that the implicit bias that we bring into situations affects our perception of ought. See, ought is not as simple a word because, believe me, right, we could sit there and have a debate. We could sit here and have a conversation and say, what do you think ought to be? And we're going to have a whole lot of different oughts. It affects our perception, and it also affects our perception of others' motivations. For example, here's one that's very common in the Christian church. Is the synagogue leader a bad person? It's really easy and far too common and not a credit to our faith when we impute to the religious leaders of Scripture malicious intent when it's not explicitly so. All right? Not every religious leader who says something that isn't great did so maliciously. All right? They have different perspectives on what their duties and responsibilities are. For instance, in the Jewish community has been a persecuted community throughout history. All right? And a lot of their customs are about the maintenance of group identity. A lot of their customs are about binding the community together through shared customs, shared practices, so that the community is more unified, and by being more unified, they are better able to withstand the persecution that has happened to Jewish persons around the world for centuries. And one of the most visible markers and customs of Jewish identity is Sabbath observance. That's why it is so important to them, because it shows the world that they are not in it alone. It shows the world when you see them around here, because we're in a neighborhood with so many Orthodox Jews, when you see them walking on the streets on Saturday instead of driving, okay? It's them demonstrating to one another and the world that they are unified as a community. And so the violation of the Sabbath law could mean that the synagogue leader wasn't being as heartless as it's easy for us to depict, but rather that the synagogue leader was simply saying, hey, do you want to discard the rules that define us? Why can't she come back tomorrow and preserve that rule? All right? He's defending rules that defined Jewish identity. But Jesus was promoting a different rule. Jesus wasn't invalidating what he said. Jesus never said, stop observing the Sabbath. What Jesus was saying was, yeah, I get that. But there are also more important rules. Okay? It's like the ER. First come, first served, unless you're about to die. Then it's not first come, first serve anymore. Okay? There are rules, and there are greater rules. And Jesus was saying, the rules that exalt human dignity, the rules that elevate the care of people above the care of your animals, has to be a more important rule than the observance of the Sabbath. Neither of these is necessarily bad. All right? Neither of these is bad. You just have to choose your ought. All right? And the oughts change. I remember when I was a kid, one of the big oughts for men, boys, don't wear a hat inside. Oh, when I was in grade school, if I didn't take my hat off when I entered a building, whoo! Oh, man. You ought to take your hat off when you come inside. Was that a bad rule? No. And, I kind of felt grown up about it. You walk in, I take off my hat, and you kind of felt for a minute a little proud. Hey, I'm being a proper gentleman here. I'm taking my hat off when I come inside. Well, that ought isn't so ought anymore. Okay? That ought just isn't the ought that it used to be. Because our oughts change. And there are a lot of oughts. And we have to rank them. And we have to choose them. But we have to choose them in accordance with what Jesus says. And we have to be committed to the oughts that Jesus puts before us. So our ought to be is defined by the principles Jesus teaches us. And religious customs are not bad. Societal norms are not bad. But love and justice and human dignity are more important oughts for us to promote in our world. And privilege gives us the responsibility to create what Jesus says ought to be. See, we have the right to our freedom. We have the right to make choices, but it is our faith that is the bill of responsibilities that needs to guide our lives. Our faith says, what is your responsibility to the other? What is your responsibility to your neighbor? What is your responsibility to the future? Right. What is your responsibility to create the world that Jesus says ought to be? And that will come with disruption. Because even if we are comfortable and used to the way things are, what ought to be will always disrupt what is. And we have to be willing to cause that disruption, to proactively create that disruption in the service of moving what is to what ought to be. Amen.